Sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to fight for. When your own father abandons you and leaves you nothing but a broken cabin worth $1, you learn that family isn't always blood. Elijah Carter knew this truth when he returned to Clearwater, Wyoming, with his 12-year-old son. The townspeople laughed at the idea of him starting over with nothing. They remembered him as the bastard kid they'd run out of town 20 years ago. Now here he was, loading supplies into his old truck, planning to fix up that worthless shack on the edge of town. But Elijah had learned something important over the years. Sometimes the things that look worthless hold the greatest value. His father Samuel had spent his final years hiding secrets in that cabin. Secrets that could change everything for a man trying to build a better life for his son. But what happens when those secrets attract the wrong kind of attention? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up behind Elijah Carter's weathered Ford pickup as it rolled down Main Street, carrying everything he and his son owned in the world. The truck had seen better days, much like its owner, but it had gotten them from Colorado to Wyoming without breaking down, and that was something to be grateful for. Danny sat in the passenger seat, his worn baseball glove resting on his lap, watching the storefronts of Clearwater pass by with the careful attention of a boy who had learned to read the mood of a town before deciding whether to stay or run. "That's Murphy's General Store," Elijah said, pointing to a faded red building with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign that had weathered 20 Wyoming winters. "Your grandfather used to send me there for supplies when I was about your age." Danny nodded, but didn't respond immediately. At 12, he had developed the habit of listening more than speaking, a trait that served him well when adults thought he wasn't paying attention. He had heard enough conversations between his father and various landlords, employers, and bill collectors to understand that their life had been a series of temporary stops and fresh starts. This move to Wyoming felt different, though. There was something in his father's voice when he talked about the cabin they were inheriting, a mixture of hope and old pain that Danny recognized but didn't fully understand. The inheritance letter lay folded in Elijah's shirt pocket, the edges soft from repeated handling. It had arrived 3 months ago at their cramped apartment in Denver, delivered by a lawyer who seemed surprised that Samuel Carter had any living relatives to notify. The letter was brief and formal, stating that Samuel Carter had died of liver failure and left his property, described as 1 cabin and associated land parcel, valued at $1, to his son Elijah Carter, $1. Even the lawyer had seemed embarrassed by the amount, but Elijah had read something else in that letter, something the lawyer probably missed. His father had specifically requested that the property not be sold until Elijah had seen it personally. There was a reason for that request, though Elijah couldn't yet imagine what it might be. They turned off Main Street onto a dirt road that led toward the foothills, where scattered houses gave way to open rangeland, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional windmill. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the late spring warmth. This was the landscape of Elijah's childhood, though he had spent the last 20 years trying to forget it. "Tell me about grandfather again," Danny said quietly. Elijah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was the conversation he had been dreading since they left Denver. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that his grandfather was a drunk who abandoned his son when life became too difficult? How do you make sense of a man who could disappear for months at a time, leaving a 16-year-old to fend for himself in a town where nobody particularly cared whether he lived or died? "Samuel was complicated," Elijah said finally. "He worked cattle ranches most of his life, strong as an ox when he was sober, but he had demons he couldn't shake. When your grandmother died, that was before you were born, before I even met your mother, he just couldn't handle the grief. Started drinking heavy and never really stopped. But he left us the cabin, he did. So maybe he changed." Elijah wanted to believe that. He wanted to think that his father had found some peace in his final years. that the man who had taught him to ride horses and read the weather had eventually overcome the man who drank away their grocery money and disappeared for weeks at a time. But 20 years of silence was a long time to hope for redemption. They crested a small hill and saw it, the cabin that was now legally theirs for the princely sum of $1. Elijah pulled the truck to a stop and stared at what remained of his childhood home. The cabin was worse than he had imagined. The roof sagged in the middle, several boards had fallen away from the walls, and what had once been a front porch was now a collection of rotting timber and broken steps. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and a tree had fallen across the back corner, leaving a gap in the wall that was covered with nothing but a piece of rusty sheet metal. "It's not so bad," Danny said. Though his voice lacked conviction, Elijah smiled despite himself. His son had inherited his mother's optimism, along with her dark eyes and stubborn chin. "It needs some work, a lot of work. We've got time." They climbed out of the truck and approached the cabin slowly, as if it might collapse from the vibration of their footsteps. Elijah pulled out the key the lawyer had given him, an old brass key that looked like it belonged on a museum display, and worked it into the lock. The door opened with a groan of protest, revealing the interior of his father's final home. It was better inside than out, though that wasn't saying much. The main room had a stone fireplace that looked solid, and the wooden floors were worn but intact. Someone had made an effort to keep the place livable. There were relatively new patches in the walls where holes had been covered, and the windows, while old, were unbroken and clean. A small kitchen occupied one corner, with a hand pump for water and a wood-burning stove that looked like it had been recently used. "There's electricity," Danny observed, pointing to a modern electrical outlet that had been installed next to the kitchen area. Elijah flipped a switch and was surprised when an overhead bulb flickered to life. "Well, that's something." They explored the rest of the cabin, which didn't take long. Besides the main room, there was a small bedroom that had obviously been Samuel's. The bed was neatly made, and clothes still hung in a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and tobacco. A second, smaller room could serve as Danny's bedroom once they cleaned out the boxes and old furniture that were currently stored there. But it was the main room that drew Elijah's attention. This was where he had spent most of his childhood doing homework at the wooden table while his father worked on ranch accounts or read from one of the many books that had lined the walls. The books were gone now, but the shelves remained, along with memories that felt both foreign and familiar after 20 years. "Dad." Danny was standing near the fireplace, examining something on the mantelpiece. "Look at this." Elijah walked over to see what had caught his son's attention. It was a photograph in a simple wooden frame, a picture he hadn't seen in decades. The photo showed a much younger Elijah, probably 14 or 15, standing next to a horse with Samuel's arm around his shoulders. Both of them were smiling, and Samuel looked healthy and sober in a way that Elijah had almost forgotten. "That's you and grandfather." "That was taken the summer before your grandmother died," Elijah said, studying his father's face in the photograph. "He was different then." "We both were." Danny picked up his baseball glove from where he had set it on the mantel, and absently began working the leather with his fingers, a nervous habit he had developed during the difficult months after his mother's death 2 years ago. The glove had been a gift from Elijah for Danny's 10th birthday, bought second-hand but carefully chosen. It was too big for Danny's hands at the time, but Elijah had told him he would grow into it. Now it fit perfectly, softened by use and shaped by countless hours of playing catch in apartment parking lots and city parks. "We should probably unload the truck before it gets dark," Elijah said. They spent the next hour carrying their belongings into the cabin, clothes, books, tools, and the few household items they had managed to accumulate over the years. Everything fit easily into the small space with room to spare. When they finished, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Elijah remembered from his childhood. They sat on the front steps, sharing a dinner of sandwiches and canned beans, while the evening air carried the sounds of crickets and distant cattle. The town of Clearwater was visible in the valley below them, its lights beginning to twinkle as families settled in for the night. "It's quiet here," Danny observed. "Different kind of quiet than the city. I like it." Elijah looked at his son and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of possibility. Maybe they could make this work. Maybe the broken-down cabin could become a home, and maybe the boy beside him could grow up with the stability that Elijah had never known. "Dad, why didn't Grandfather ever visit us?" The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Elijah had wondered the same thing countless times over the years, especially after Danny was born. Why hadn't Samuel wanted to know his grandson? Why hadn't he reached out when Danny's mother died and left Elijah struggling to raise a son alone? "Pride, maybe," Elijah said finally. "Or shame. Sometimes when a man makes mistakes, he convinces himself it's better to stay away than to risk making things worse." "Do you think he was sorry?" Elijah looked at the photograph Danny still held in his hands. "I think he must have been. Otherwise, why leave us this place?" As the stars began to appear overhead, they moved inside and built a fire in the fireplace, using wood that Samuel had left neatly stacked beside the hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for the first time in months, Elijah felt something approaching peace. "Tell me about when you lived here," Danny said, curled up in his sleeping bag near the fire. So Elijah told him stories about learning to ride horses before he could properly walk, about helping with cattle drives in the summer, about the hard winters when snow would pile up to the windows, and they would spend weeks at a time without seeing another soul. He told him about the good times, before the drinking became too much and before Samuel's grief turned into something that consumed everything. In its path, he didn't tell Danny about the bad times, about coming home from school to find his father passed out on the floor, about the nights when Samuel would disappear and leave a teenager to wonder if he was coming back, about the morning when Elijah finally decided he had to leave or risk becoming something he didn't want to be. Those stories could wait. For now, it was enough to share the warmth of the fire and the promise of tomorrow. As Danny drifted off to sleep, Elijah sat staring into the flames and thinking about second chances. His father was gone, but perhaps the cabin could become something more than just a reminder of old pain. Perhaps it could become the foundation for the life he had always wanted to give his son, a place where roots could grow deep and strong, where a boy could learn that home wasn't just a place you lived, but a place you belonged. Outside, the wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the sounds and smells of a land that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The cabin needed extensive repairs. They needed to find work. And Elijah suspected that returning to Clearwater after 20 years would not be as simple as just moving into an old house. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elijah Carter felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning sun streamed through the cabin's dusty windows, revealing the full scope of the work ahead. Elijah woke early, as was his habit, and stepped outside to survey their new domain in proper daylight. The property extended further than he had realized the evening before, maybe 40 acres of grassland and scrub brush, bordered by a creek that ran down from the mountains. It wasn't much by Wyoming standards, but it was more land than he had ever owned. Danny emerged from the cabin rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, son." "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months." Danny stretched and looked around at the landscape. "Where do we start?" Elijah smiled at his son's eagerness. "Breakfast first. Then we see what your grandfather left us to work with." They ate a simple meal of eggs and toast, prepared on Samuel's wood-burning stove, then began a systematic exploration of the cabin's condition. The roof would need significant repair before winter. Several shingles were missing, and there were signs of water damage in the bedroom. The foundation was solid stone, though, and the basic structure was sound enough to build upon. It was while they were examining the main room's floorboards that Elijah noticed something odd. Near the fireplace One of the wide pine boards didn't quite align with the others. When he knelt down and pressed on it, the board shifted slightly. "That's loose," Danny observed, kneeling beside his father. Elijah worked his fingers under the edge of the board and lifted. It came up easily, revealing a shallow space beneath. Hidden in that space was a leather-wrapped bundle, protected from moisture by an old oilcloth. "What is it?" Danny asked, his voice hushed with excitement. Elijah carefully lifted the bundle and unwrapped it on the kitchen table. Inside was a journal bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. The cover bore Samuel's initials, carved into the leather with a pocket knife. Beneath the journal was an envelope addressed in Samuel's familiar handwriting, "For Elijah." With trembling fingers, Elijah opened the journal to the first page. The entries were dated, starting from about 5 years ago, written in Samuel's careful script, June 15th. Been sober now for 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Doc says the liver damage can't be undone, but maybe there's still time to make things right. Found something today in the old county records that changes everything. If I'm right about this, maybe I can leave the boy something worthwhile after all. Danny leaned against his father's shoulder, reading along. Grandfather quit drinking? Elijah turned the page, his heart pounding. The entries continued. June 20th, spent the day at the library in Cheyenne, looking through Civil War records and territorial survey maps. The stories the old-timers used to tell weren't just stories. There really was a Confederate supply train that disappeared somewhere in this area in 1864. The official reports say it was carrying gold and silver to fund Confederate operations in the territories. June 25th, measured the distance from the old oak tree to the creek bed. Matches the description in the surveyor's notes I found. Problem is, Jake Morrison's been asking questions about what I'm doing out here. Need to be more careful. Jake Morrison. Elijah remembered him, a man about Samuel's age who had worked various ranches around Clearwater. They had been friends of sorts, though Jake had always struck Elijah as the kind of person who looked for easy solutions to life's problems. The journal entries continued for pages, documenting Samuel's research into local history, his careful measurements of the property, and his growing certainty that something valuable was hidden somewhere on the land. But they also revealed something else, a man genuinely struggling to overcome his demons and make amends for his failures. December 12th. Haven't had a drink in 3 years now. Still wake up wanting one, but the want is getting quieter. Saw Elijah's boy in town today with Martha Henderson. Handsome child. Looks like his mother. Martha says Elijah's doing well in Colorado, working construction. I should write to him, but what would I say? Sorry I was too drunk to be your father. Sorry I let you down when you needed me most. Danny looked up at his father. He saw me in town. Elijah frowned. When were you ever in Clearwater before this? I wasn't. At least I don't remember being here. They continued reading. The entries became more focused on Samuel's research, filled with references to measurements, angles, and distances that made little sense without context. But scattered throughout were personal reflections that painted a picture of a man haunted by regret and desperate for redemption. January 3rd. If I'm right about the cache location, it could change everything for Elijah and the boy. All these years I thought I had nothing to leave them but debt and disappointment. Maybe God gives second chances after all. The journal's final entry was dated just 2 months before Samuel's death. March 8th. Jake's getting suspicious, asking too many questions about why I spend so much time surveying the property. Think he knows I'm onto something. If anything happens to me, I've left everything Elijah needs to finish what I started. The boy deserves a better inheritance than his father's mistakes. Elijah closed the journal and sat back in his chair. His father had spent his final years sober, researching some kind of treasure that might or might not exist on their property. It seemed almost too fantastic to believe, yet the journal was filled with specific details and careful observations that suggested Samuel had been deadly serious about his research. Dad, do you think it's true? About the Confederate gold? Elijah opened the envelope addressed to him. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Samuel's handwriting. Elijah, If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've inherited more than just a broken-down cabin. I spent 5 years researching the stories about Confederate gold hidden in this area during the war. I believe there's a cache buried somewhere on our property, probably near the creek, where the old oak tree marks a surveyor's reference point. I never found it, but I came close. The journal has all my research and measurements. If I'm right, there's enough there to give you and the boy a real future. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for the kind of father I was, but maybe I can still do right by you in the end. Samuel, he really believed it was out there, Elijah said softly. Danny picked up the journal again, flipping through pages filled with diagrams and measurements. Look at this, Dad. These drawings, they're like treasure maps. Before Elijah could respond, they heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. Through the window, he saw a familiar green pickup truck pulling into their yard. His stomach tightened as he recognized the driver. Jake Morrison climbed out of his truck and approached the cabin. He was a few years older than Elijah remembered, his face weathered by sun and hard living. But his eyes held the same calculating look that had always made Elijah uncomfortable. "Jake," Elijah said as he stepped outside, leaving Danny in the cabin with the journal. "Elijah Carter. Heard you were back in town." Jake's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sorry for your loss." "Samuel was a good man. Thank you. Hell of a thing, leaving you nothing but this old place. Must be tough, starting over with a kid to support." Jake's gaze swept over the property with obvious interest. "Course, you probably can't wait to sell it and get back to civilization." "Actually, we're planning to stay." Jake's expression shifted slightly. "Stay? Here? Place needs a fortune in repairs just to be habitable. We'll manage." "Look, Elijah, I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but your father spent his last few years digging holes all over this property, acting strange, talking about buried treasure and such nonsense. Liver disease can affect a man's mind, you know." Elijah kept his expression neutral. "Is that so?" "Fact is, I've been thinking this land might be better suited for grazing. I could make you a fair offer, more than it's worth considering the state of things. Give you enough to make a fresh start somewhere with better opportunities for the boy. That's generous, but we're not interested in selling." Jake's smile faded. "You sure about that?" "This isn't Colorado, Elijah. Clearwater has a long memory, and not everyone's happy about you coming back." The threat in Jake's voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Elijah took a step closer, drawing on years of construction work that had kept him strong despite his 42 years. "Is that supposed to worry me?" "Just friendly advice. Sometimes a man's better off knowing when to walk away." Jake returned to his truck and drove off without another word, leaving Elijah standing in the yard with a growing sense of unease. His father's journal suddenly seemed less like the fantasy of a sick man and more like the research notes of someone who had discovered something valuable, something that Jake Morrison wanted very badly. Inside the cabin, Danny was still studying the journal. "I heard what he said about grandfather digging holes. Dad, what if the treasure is real?" Elijah sat down across from his son. "Even if it is, we need to be careful. Jake didn't drive out here just to offer condolences. You think he knows about the journal?" "I think your grandfather was right to be suspicious of him." Elijah took the journal and flipped through its pages again. "Your grandfather spent 5 years researching this. Maybe it's time we found out what he discovered." Danny's eyes lit up. "You mean we're going to look for it?" "I mean, we're going to finish what your grandfather started." "But Danny," Elijah looked seriously at his son, "this stays between us for now. If there really is something valuable on this property, we need to be smart about how we handle it." As the afternoon wore on, they studied Samuel's journal more carefully. The entries painted a picture of methodical research and careful observation. Samuel had identified several potential locations based on his interpretation of Civil War-era survey maps and local historical accounts. The most promising site appeared to be near a large oak tree by the creek, about a quarter-mile from the cabin. "Should we go look?" Danny asked eagerly. Elijah considered this. Part of him wanted to dismiss his father's research as the delusion of a sick man trying to make amends for a lifetime of failure. But another part, the part that remembered Samuel in his better moments. Teaching a young boy to track deer and read the weather, recognized the careful intelligence behind the journal entries. Tomorrow, he decided. Today we focus on making this place livable. If we're going to treasure hunt, we need a secure base of operations. They spent the rest of the day cleaning and organizing, but Elijah's mind kept returning to Jake Morrison's visit and his father's warnings about suspicious questions. As evening fell and they prepared another simple meal, he found himself looking out the windows more frequently, watching for vehicles on the distant road. "Dad," Danny said as they sat down to eat, "are you worried about Mr. Morrison?" "A little," Elijah admitted. "But that's my job, to worry about things so you don't have to," Danny nodded solemnly. At 12, he had already learned more about adult worries than most children his age. But there was something different in his expression now, a spark of excitement and purpose that Elijah hadn't seen since before his wife's death. "I'm glad we came here," Danny said quietly, "even if the cabin's falling down and we might have angry neighbors. Especially because of that." Danny smiled, the first genuinely carefree smile Elijah had seen from him in months. "It feels like an adventure." As they settled in for their second night in the cabin, Elijah tucked Samuel's journal safely away beneath the loose floorboard. Tomorrow they would begin following his father's research, searching for something that might or might not exist. But tonight, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense that their life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass and carried with it the promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Elijah woke before dawn to the sound of Danny moving quietly around the cabin. He found his son at the kitchen table, studying Samuel's journal by lamplight with the intense concentration of a scholar working on an important translation. "You're up early," Elijah said. "Lighting the wood stove to make coffee. I couldn't sleep." "And Dad, look at this." Danny pointed to a page near the middle of the journal. "Grandfather drew maps in the margins. See these measurements? They're all based on distances from specific landmarks." Elijah leaned over his son's shoulder to examine the page. Samuel had indeed sketched crude but detailed maps alongside his written observations. The drawings showed the relative positions of the cabin, the creek, several large trees, and what appeared to be rock formations or other permanent markers. "This looks like a surveyor's compass," Danny said, pointing to a small drawing at the bottom of the page. "And these numbers, they look like compass bearings." Elijah studied the sketches more carefully. His father had always been methodical, but this level of precision suggested he had been using actual surveying equipment. Where would he have gotten a compass? Maybe it's still here somewhere. They spent the next hour searching the cabin systematically. In a wooden crate beneath Samuel's bed, they found tools, spare clothes, and a collection of books about local history and Civil War military operations. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was an antique brass surveyor's compass. The instrument was old, but well maintained, its brass surface polished to a warm glow. A small tag tied to its handle bore Samuel's handwriting, "Property of Wyoming Territorial Survey, 1880s, found in Henderson's store basement, purchased 1962. "He's had this thing for decades," Elijah said, turning the compass over in his hands. The mechanism still moved smoothly, and the magnetic needle pointed steadily north. Danny opened the journal to a page filled with compass bearings and measurements. "Look, Dad. From the big oak tree, 37 degrees northeast for 150 paces, then due north for another 75 paces to a pile of stones. From the stones, southwest back toward the creek, you think he was mapping out search patterns? I think he found something and was trying to figure out exactly where it was located." They prepared a quick breakfast, then set out to follow Samuel's directions. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Danny carried the compass, while Elijah brought the journal and a measuring tape he had found among Samuel's tools. The oak tree mentioned in Samuel's notes was easy to find, a massive specimen that had probably been growing beside the creek for more than a century. Its trunk was easily 6 feet in diameter, and its branches spread wide enough to provide shade for a small gathering. "This has to be it," Elijah said, consulting the journal. "Your grandfather mentions it in at least a dozen entries." Danny held the compass and oriented it carefully. 37 degrees northeast, he announced, pointing in the indicated direction. They paced off the distance together, counting steps in the methodical way Samuel had described in his notes. At 150 paces, they found themselves standing near a small rise in the ground where someone had indeed arranged stones in a rough circle. "These aren't natural," Elijah observed, kneeling beside the stones. "Someone placed them here deliberately." "Grandfather? Maybe, or maybe whoever he was tracking." Elijah stood and consulted the journal again. "According to this, we go southwest from here back toward the creek." As they followed the indicated bearing, Danny suddenly stopped. "Dad, look at this." He was pointing to a section of ground that was subtly different from the surrounding area. The grass was slightly shorter and a different shade of green, as if the soil beneath had been disturbed and reseeded. "Someone's been digging here," Elijah said, kneeling to examine the earth more closely. The difference was subtle, but once he noticed it, the outline of a rectangular area about 6 feet by 4 feet became obvious. "Recently?" "Hard to say. Could be months ago, could be a couple of years." Elijah stood and looked around the area carefully. "But your grandfather's last journal entry was only 2 months before he died." They were so focused on examining the ground that they didn't notice the approaching vehicle until it was almost upon them. A sheriff's patrol truck pulled up near the oak tree, and a man in uniform climbed out. Elijah recognized him immediately, though 20 years had added gray to his hair and lines around his eyes. Wade Murphy had been 2 years ahead of Elijah in school, one of the few kids who had occasionally stood up for the bastard son of the town drunk. They had been friends of sorts, at least until the night Elijah left Clearwater for good. "Wade," Elijah said, walking over to meet him. "Elijah." Sheriff Murphy's expression was carefully neutral. "Heard you were back in town. Jake Morrison mentioned he stopped by to pay his respects." "That's one way to put it." Murphy glanced at Danny, who was still standing near the disturbed ground with the compass in his hands. "This your boy? Danny, come meet Sheriff Murphy." Danny approached politely and shook the sheriff's offered hand. "Pleasure to meet you, sir." "Likewise." "You settling in all right at your grandfather's place?" "Yes, sir. Dad and I are fixing it up." Murphy nodded and turned his attention back to Elijah. "Mind if we talk privately for a minute?" Elijah looked at Danny. "Why don't you see if you can find any more of those stone markers while the sheriff and I catch up?" When Danny was out of earshot, Murphy's expression softened slightly. "Look, Elijah, I'm glad you're back. Lord knows this town could use a few good people who aren't afraid of hard work. But I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. All right? Jake Morrison thinks you might be planning to continue your father's treasure hunting. He's worried you might start tearing up the countryside looking for something that probably doesn't exist." Elijah studied his old friend's face. "What do you think about Jake's concerns?" "I think Jake Morrison has his own reasons for wanting you gone." Murphy glanced around the property. "Your father spent a lot of time out here his last few years. Lot of folks thought he'd lost his mind, but Samuel was always sharp when he was sober. If he believed there was something worth finding, maybe there was. So you don't think we should leave?" "Hell no, but I think you should be careful who you trust." Murphy looked directly at Elijah. "Jake owes money to some people who don't accept late payments gracefully. Word is, he's been looking for a quick score to pay off his debts. You're warning me about Jake." "I'm warning you that desperate men do stupid things. And Jake Morrison is getting pretty desperate," Danny called out from near the creek. "Dad, Sheriff Murphy, you need to see this." They walked over to where Danny was kneeling beside another arrangement of stones. These were larger than the first set, positioned in a more complex pattern that formed an arrow pointing toward the creek bank. "These definitely aren't natural," Murphy observed. "Someone placed them here with a specific purpose." Danny opened Samuel's journal to a page near the end. "Look at this entry from last January. Grandfather writes about finding the final marker and being close to the answer." Elijah read the passage over Danny's shoulder. Samuel's handwriting was excited, less controlled than his earlier entries. January 15th found the directional marker today, exactly where the 1864 survey notes indicated it would be. The stones point toward the creek bank, about 20 yards from the Big Bend. If the cache is really there, it's been underwater during spring floods for more than a century. That would explain why no one's found it before. Need to wait for late summer when the water level drops. The water's low now, Danny pointed out. Murphy looked at the creek, then at Elijah. What are you thinking? I'm thinking my father spent 5 years researching this. Maybe it's time we found out if he was right. They walked to the creek bank, where the stones were pointing. The water ran clear and shallow over a bed of rounded stones, but near the bank, where seasonal flooding would have deposited layers of silt and debris, the bottom was muddy and obscured. There, Danny said suddenly, pointing to a section of the bank where the earth looked different, darker and more compacted than the surrounding soil. Elijah knelt and probed the area with his fingers. About 6 inches down, he encountered something hard and regular, too uniform to be a natural stone. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I think we've found something." Murphy knelt beside him and helped clear away the mud and debris. What they uncovered was the corner of what appeared to be a wooden crate, preserved by the constant moisture and protected from decay by the anaerobic conditions of the creek bank. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy said softly. Danny was practically vibrating with excitement. "Is it the treasure?" "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Elijah cautioned, though his own heart was pounding. Could be anything. But even as he said it, he was thinking about his father's careful research, his methodical approach to solving a century-old mystery. Samuel had found something, and now they were on the verge of discovering what it was. Murphy stood and brushed mud from his hands. "Elijah, I need to ask you something else, and this is important. Have you told anyone else about your father's journal?" "Just Danny." "Good. Keep it that way for now." Murphy looked around the property as if checking for observers. "I don't know what's in that crate, but if word gets out that you've found something valuable, you're going to have more visitors than you can handle. You think we should leave it alone?" "I think you should be very careful how you proceed from here. This is your property, and you have every right to explore it. But some secrets are dangerous to know." As they walked back toward the cabin, Elijah found himself thinking about his father's final years. Samuel had discovered something significant, but he had also died before he could act on that discovery. Was that coincidence, or had his treasure hunting attracted the wrong kind of attention? "Dad," Danny said as they reached the cabin, "are we really going to dig up that crate?" Elijah looked at his son, intelligent, excited, and trusting his father to make the right decision. Then he looked at Sheriff Murphy, whose expression suggested that whatever they had found was going to complicate their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "Tomorrow," he decided. "Tonight, we think about this carefully and make sure we're ready for whatever we might find." But as they prepared dinner and settled in for the evening, Elijah couldn't stop thinking about the wooden crate buried in the creek bank. His father had spent years searching for it, and now it was within reach. The question was whether Samuel had been looking for treasure or for redemption, and whether Elijah was about to find both or neither. The next morning arrived with a sense of anticipation that made both father and son restless. They ate breakfast quickly, gathered tools for excavation, and returned to the creek bank, where the partially exposed crate waited beneath its layer of mud and silt, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. They used small hand tools to clear away the accumulated debris. The crate was larger than they had initially realized, roughly the size of a steamer trunk and constructed from thick oak planks that had been sealed with some kind of tar or pitch that had preserved the wood remarkably well. "It's heavy," Elijah noted as they attempted to work it free from its muddy resting place. "Whatever's inside, there's a lot of it." Danny helped him clear the last of the mud away from the edges. "Dad, look at this." He was pointing to metal fittings on the corners of the crate, brass reinforcements that were green with age but still solid. More importantly, there was a brass plate on the lid, corroded but still legible. In careful engraved letters it read, CSA Supply Corps, Richmond, Virginia, 1863. Confederate States of America, Elijah said softly. Your grandfather was right. They managed to lift the crate from its resting place and carry it back to the cabin, where they could examine it properly in good light. The lid was secured with a heavy iron hasp, but the lock mechanism had corroded away decades ago. With careful application of penetrating oil and patience, Elijah was able to work the hasp free. Ready? He asked Danny. His son nodded, eyes wide with anticipation. Elijah lifted the lid, and they both stared in amazement at what lay inside. The crate was filled with small canvas bags, each one carefully tied and marked with numbers written in faded ink. Beneath the bags, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture, were several leather-bound ledgers and what appeared to be official documents. With trembling hands, Elijah lifted one of the smaller bags and carefully untied the cord that secured it. Inside were coins, dozens of them, each one bearing the distinctive design of Confederate currency. But these weren't the paper money that most people associated with the Confederacy. These were gold coins, minted in small quantities during the war, and now worth far more than their original face value. Dad, Danny whispered, we're rich. Elijah picked up one of the coins and examined it carefully. It was heavier than modern currency, and despite more than a century of storage, it gleamed with the unmistakable luster of genuine gold. This is just one bag, son. There are at least 20 more in here. They spent the next hour cataloging the contents of the crate. Besides the gold coins, there were silver pieces, jewelry that had probably been donated to the Confederate cause, and several small bars of precious metal. The ledgers documented the collection and transport of the valuables, with entries dating from 1863 and 1864. According to the documents, the cash had been assembled in Richmond and was being transported west to fund Confederate operations in the territories when the war ended, and the escort detail apparently decided to hide the treasure rather than surrender it to Union forces. Look at this, Danny said, studying one of the ledgers. The last entry says they buried the cash at the marked location near Clearwater Station to be recovered when conditions permit. Conditions never permitted, Elijah observed. The men who buried this probably died in the war or moved on and never came back. As they examined their discovery, Elijah found himself thinking about the implications. Even conservative estimates suggested the gold alone was worth several $100,000, and some of the coins and jewelry might have additional value to collectors. It was enough money to secure Danny's education, pay for the cabin repairs, and provide the kind of financial stability that Elijah had never known. But it was also the kind of discovery that could attract unwanted attention from people like Jake Morrison. Danny, I need you to understand something important, Elijah said, carefully repacking the crate. We can't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Why not? Because people do crazy things when large amounts of money are involved. Your grandfather was careful about this research for good reasons. They moved the crate inside the cabin and concealed it beneath the loose floorboard where Samuel's journal had been hidden. The space was barely large enough, but it would have to do until they could make more permanent arrangements. As they worked, Elijah heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, he saw Jake Morrison's truck turning into their yard, but this time Jake wasn't alone. 2 other men sat in the cab with him, men Elijah didn't recognize, but who had the hard look of people accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. Stay inside, Elijah told Danny. Whatever happens, don't mention the crate. Jake climbed out of the truck with his companions and approached the cabin. Up close, the 2 strangers looked even less friendly. One was a large man with scarred knuckles and the flat stare of someone who enjoyed hurting people, while the other was smaller, but carried himself with the coiled tension of a man who was quick with a knife or gun. Morning, Elijah, Jake said with false cheerfulness. Brought some friends along. We've been thinking about your situation. What situation is that? Well, you're new back to town, trying to fix up this old place with no real income. These are hard times for working folks. Jake gestured toward his companions. My friends here are businessmen. They understand how to help people with financial problems. The larger man spoke for the first time. Name's Vance. Jake tells us you might be interested in selling this property. Jake was misinformed. See, that's where things get complicated, Vance continued, moving closer to the porch. Because Jake's told us about all the digging your old man was doing out here. Stories about buried treasure and such. Now, we're not superstitious men, but we figure where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Elijah stepped outside and closed the cabin door behind him, keeping his body between the men and Danny. I think you gentlemen should leave. The smaller man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Friendly neighborhood, Jake, real welcoming. Look, Elijah, Jake said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that didn't quite hide the threat underneath. These men represent certain interests. They've advanced me some money based on the expectation that this property might be available for development. If I can't deliver what I promised, that sounds like your problem, not mine. Vance stepped closer, and Elijah could smell alcohol and tobacco on his breath. Maybe you don't understand the situation. Jake owes our employer a considerable sum. He suggested that this property might contain assets that could cover his debt. We're here to evaluate those assets. There are no assets. Just a broken-down cabin and 40 acres of scrubland. Then you won't mind if we take a look around. Actually, I would mind. This is private property. The tension ratcheted up another notch. Vance's hand moved casually toward his jacket, and Elijah caught a glimpse of metal, either a gun or a knife. The smaller man was circling to get a better angle, while Jake stood back looking sick with fear and desperation. Before the situation could escalate further, they heard another vehicle approaching. Sheriff Murphy's patrol truck came over the rise and pulled into the yard. The sheriff taking in the scene with a quick professional assessment. Afternoon. Folks, Murphy said as he climbed out of his vehicle. Everything all right here? Just fine, Sheriff, Jake replied quickly. Just visiting with an old friend. Murphy's gaze moved from Jake to his companions, and his expression hardened slightly. Don't believe I've had the pleasure of meeting your friends, Jake. Vance straightened up, but kept his hands visible. Just passing through, Sheriff. Heard there might be some property for sale in the area. Is that so? Murphy looked at Elijah. Elijah, you selling? No, I'm not. Well, then I guess there's nothing more to discuss. Murphy's tone was polite, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Jake, why don't you and your friends head back to town? I'm sure you've got business to attend to. For a moment it looked like Vance might argue, but Jake grabbed his arm. Come on, we can talk about this later. They climbed into the truck and drove away, leaving Elijah, Murphy, and Danny, who had emerged from the cabin despite his father's instructions, standing in the yard. Friends of yours? Murphy asked Jake's retreating vehicle. Not exactly. Murphy studied Elijah's face carefully. Those men weren't from around here. Jake's been running with a rough crowd lately. People who loan money at high interest and aren't particular about collection methods. He mentioned that he owes someone money. More than someone. Jake's into a criminal organization based out of Cheyenne for about $50,000. Gambling debts mostly, but he's been trying to convince them that he has access to valuable assets. Elijah felt his stomach tighten. Assets on this property? That's what I'm afraid of. Murphy looked around the property with new understanding. Did you find what your father was looking for? The question hung in the air like smoke. Elijah looked at Danny, who was watching both men with the careful attention of a child, who understood that adult decisions were being made that would affect his future. Sheriff, Elijah said finally, what would you do if you found something valuable that belonged to you legally, but that other people wanted badly enough to hurt you for it? Murphy considered this for a long moment. I'd be very careful about who I trusted and very smart about how I handled it. And I'd make sure I had good legal advice before I made any moves that couldn't be undone. Good advice. Elijah, I need to ask you something directly. Are you and Danny in danger? Elijah looked at his son, then at the sheriff who had been his friend 20 years ago and might be his ally now. I think we might be. Then we need to talk about how to keep you safe while you figure out your next move. Because those men aren't going to give up just because I ran them off today. As the afternoon wore on and they discussed security measures and legal options, Elijah found himself thinking about the crate hidden beneath the floorboards. His father had spent years researching and searching for that treasure, driven by guilt and the hope of redemption. Now that search had led to a discovery that could provide for Danny's future, or get them both killed if they weren't careful. The Confederate gold was real, but so was the danger it represented. The question now was whether they could find a way to claim their inheritance without losing everything else in the process. 3 days passed with no sign of Jake Morrison or his dangerous associates, but the tension never fully left Elijah's shoulders. He and Danny continued working on cabin repairs during the day, but their evenings were spent studying Samuel's research more carefully, looking for clues they might have missed. It was Danny who made the next significant discovery. While examining the binding of Samuel's journal more carefully, he found something his father had overlooked, a second folded paper tucked between the leather cover and the first page of entries. "Dad, look at this," Danny said, carefully extracting the hidden document. It was a map, hand-drawn but remarkably detailed, showing not just their property, but the entire area around Clearwater. The map appeared to be copied from an older source, possibly a military survey from the Civil War era. What made it significant were the markings Samuel had added in red ink, X's marking specific locations, lines connecting various landmarks, and notations in the margins that referenced distances and compass bearings. "This is different from the sketches in the journal," Elijah observed, studying the map carefully. "This shows multiple cache sites." Danny pointed to a series of X's that formed a rough line extending from their property toward the mountains. "Look, there's one near the creek where we found the first crate, but there are at least 4 others marked." The implications were staggering. If Samuel was correct, the Confederate treasure they had discovered was just part of a larger cache that had been divided and hidden at multiple locations to reduce the risk of losing everything to a single discovery. "Your grandfather was thorough," Elijah said with growing admiration. "He wasn't just treasure hunting. He was conducting a proper archaeological investigation." They decided to investigate the nearest marked location, about half a mile north of their property, near an old abandoned mine shaft. According to Samuel's notations, this site was referenced in a diary kept by one of the Confederate soldiers who had participated in the original burial. The hike to the location took them through terrain that was rougher than their own property, rocky ground, dotted with sagebrush and the occasional pine tree. The old mine had been abandoned for decades, its entrance partially collapsed and overgrown with vegetation. "There," Danny said, pointing to a distinctive rock formation about 50 yards from the mine entrance. "That matches the drawing on Grandfather's map." They approached the rocks carefully, using Samuel's compass and measurements to locate the exact spot he had marked. Unlike the creek site, this location showed clear evidence of recent excavation. Someone had been digging here within the past year or 2. Grandfather found this one too, Elijah realized, kneeling beside a carefully filled hole. But he covered it back up. Danny was examining the area around the dig site. "Dad, there's something else here." He had found a small pile of stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, not random, but clearly placed by human hands to mark something specific. Underneath the stones was a metal container, like an old ammunition box, protected from the elements by a tight-fitting lid. Inside the container was another letter from Samuel, along with several items wrapped in oiled cloth. "Elijah, if you've found this, you've been following my research, and you probably found the main cache by the creek. This site contained mostly silver coins and some jewelry, but I moved everything to a safer location after Jake started asking too many questions. I'm an old man with a bad liver, but I'm not stupid. There are people in this town who would kill for what we've found, and I won't have that on my conscience. The items from this site are hidden in a place Jake will never think to look. Check behind the loose stone in our old root cellar." "Samuel root cellar?" Danny asked. "Where's that?" Elijah tried to remember the layout of the property from his childhood. There used to be a root cellar behind the cabin, built into the hillside. Your grandfather used it to store vegetables and preserved food. I haven't seen it since we arrived. It might be overgrown. They spent the rest of the afternoon searching the area, behind the cabin, until Danny spotted what looked like a depression in the ground, partially hidden by overgrown brush. When they cleared away the vegetation, they found the remains of the old root cellar, a stone-lined pit with a partially collapsed roof that had once been covered with wooden planks and earth. The loose stone Samuel had referenced was easy to find, a large flat stone in the back wall that shifted when pushed. Behind it was a cavity that had been carefully sealed with tar to keep out moisture. Inside the cavity were more canvas bags containing silver coins, several pieces of antique jewelry, and what appeared to be military medals or decorations. "How much do you think all this is worth?" Danny asked as they examined their latest discovery. "More than we can safely keep hidden much longer," Elijah replied. "We need help, Danny, professional help." That evening, Sheriff Murphy stopped by as he had promised, ostensibly to check on their security, but actually to continue the conversation they had started 3 days earlier. "Any more visits from Jake's friends?" he asked. "No, but we know they're still around." "Martha Henderson mentioned seeing strangers asking questions in town." Murphy nodded grimly. "They're staying at the motel outside town, paying cash and keeping to themselves. That's not the behavior of legitimate businessmen." Elijah made a decision that had been building for days. "Wade, I need to show you something. But first, I need your word that this stays between us until we figure out the right way to handle it." "You have it." Elijah led Murphy to the loose floorboard and carefully extracted the Confederate crate. When he opened it and showed the sheriff the contents, Murphy's expression went through several changes: surprise, amazement, and finally concern. "Jesus, Elijah. How much is this worth?" "Conservatively, several $100,000. Maybe more if some of these pieces have historical significance." Murphy picked up one of the gold coins and examined it carefully. "And there's more?" "At least 3 more cache sites according to my father's research. We found evidence that he'd located and moved items from at least one other site. Where are those items now?" Elijah showed him the silver and jewelry they had recovered from the root cellar. Murphy whistled softly. "No wonder Jake's desperate. If he knows about even half of this, he's looking at enough money to solve all his problems and then some. The question is, how much does he know?" Murphy considered this. "From what I can tell, Jake knows your father was researching buried treasure and that Samuel spent a lot of time surveying the property. But I don't think he knows about the specific discoveries. If he did, he wouldn't be trying to buy the property. He'd just take what he wanted. What do you think we should do?" "First, we need to get this treasure properly secured and documented. You'll need lawyers, appraisers, maybe even archaeologists if there's historical significance. This isn't the kind of thing you can just take to a coin dealer." Danny, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "What about Jake and his friends? Won't they get suspicious if lawyers start showing up?" "That's the other problem," Murphy agreed. "We need to move carefully. If word gets out that you found something valuable before we have proper security in place, you'll have every treasure hunter and criminal in 3 states heading this direction." Elijah looked at the treasure spread out on his kitchen table, then at his son, who was trying to process the magnitude of their discovery and its implications. 3 weeks ago, they had been struggling to pay rent on a cramped apartment in Denver. Now they were potentially wealthy, but also potentially in grave danger. "There's something else," Murphy said reluctantly. "I've been asking around about Jake's associates. The man you met, Vance, he's got a reputation. He's suspected in at least 2 murders related to collection activities, but nothing's been proven. The smaller man is his partner, goes by the name Cortez. They're both very bad people who work for even worse people. How long do you think we have before they make another move?" "Hard to say. Depends on how desperate Jake gets and how much pressure his employers are putting on him." Murphy looked directly at Elijah. "But I don't think you have very long. These people aren't patient, and they're not going to be discouraged by one visit from the local sheriff. As they discussed security measures and legal strategies, Elijah found himself thinking about the choices that had led to this moment. His father had spent his final years trying to make amends for a lifetime of failures, and his research had uncovered something that could provide security and opportunity for generations. But Samuel had also understood that knowledge was dangerous, and he had died before he could safely claim what he had found. Now that burden had fallen to Elijah, and every decision he made would affect not just his own future, but Danny's as well. The treasure was real, but so were the people who wanted to take it away from them. The question was whether they could find a way to claim their inheritance without paying for it with their lives. Outside, the wind whistled through the sagebrush, and somewhere in the darkness, dangerous men were making plans that would soon force Elijah to choose between wealth and safety, between his father's legacy and his son's future. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Martha Henderson arrived in her old Buick just after sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a worried expression that had become familiar to Elijah over the past week. "Morning, Martha," he said, greeting her on the porch while Danny finished getting dressed inside the cabin. "Morning, Elijah. I brought coffee and some news you need to hear." She poured coffee for both of them from the thermos, her movements efficient but tense. "Jake Morrison was in my store yesterday evening, drunk and talking too much." Elijah felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of talking?" "The kind that could get you and Danny hurt. He was going on about your father's treasure hunting, claiming Samuel wasn't always careful about who was listening when he talked about his research. Jake picked up bits and pieces over the years, and now he's filling in the gaps with his own imagination." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "There's something else. I found this among Samuel's things after he died. He asked me to give it to you, but only if you came back to Clearwater and decided to stay." Elijah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter in Samuel's handwriting, along with a small brass key. "Elijah, if Martha is giving you this letter, it means you've decided to make Clearwater your home. I hope that means you can forgive an old man for the mistakes he made when he should have been your father. I spent my last 5 years trying to find a way to give you something valuable, something that could make up for all the opportunities I took away from you when I chose drinking over family. The key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Cheyenne. Box number 247. Inside, you'll find legal documents establishing your ownership of everything I discovered, along with detailed maps and research notes I kept separate from the journal you found in the cabin. I also put aside some items that belonged to your mother, things I should have given you years ago, but was too ashamed to face you. I love you, son. I always did, even when I was too sick to show it properly." "I see." Samuel Danny emerged from the cabin and joined them on the porch. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson. What's wrong?" "Nothing that can't be handled," Martha replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Danny, your father and I need to discuss some adult matters. Would you mind feeding the chickens I brought you yesterday?" Danny looked puzzled. Martha hadn't brought any chickens, but he was smart enough to recognize a polite dismissal when he heard one. "I'll go check on the repairs to the back wall," he said diplomatically. When Danny was out of earshot, Martha's expression grew more serious. "Elijah, Jake's friends are getting impatient. They were in town again yesterday, asking questions about your father's activities before he died. They also made some inquiries about the property boundaries and whether there might be mineral rights or development potential. What did you tell them?" "Nothing useful, but they're not the only ones asking questions. Word's getting around that Samuel Carter's son is back in town, and there might be treasure involved. You know how stories grow in a place like this." Elijah studied Samuel's letter again, focusing on the references to legal documents and ownership proof. "Martha, do you know anything about my father's trips to Cheyenne in his last few years? He went there at least once a month, sometimes more. Always came back with books and papers, sometimes surveying equipment. He told me he was researching family history, but I suspected there was more to it. He was being careful, making sure everything was legal and documented." Martha nodded approvingly. Samuel was many things, but he wasn't careless when it mattered. If he found something valuable, you can be sure he did everything by the book. They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching, not just one, but several. Through the morning dust, Elijah could see Jake Morrison's truck leading a small convoy that included 2 other vehicles he didn't recognize. "Danny!" Elijah called. "Get inside, now!" Danny appeared from behind the cabin and quickly joined them on the porch as the vehicles pulled into the yard. Jake climbed out of his truck, but this time he was accompanied by 5 men instead of 2. Besides Vance and Cortez, there were 3 others who looked like they had been recruited from the worst bars in 3 counties. "Morning, folks," Jake said with forced cheerfulness. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." Martha stepped forward, her small frame suddenly radiating the kind of authority that came from 70 years of not backing down from bullies. "Jake Morrison, you're not welcome here. These people are trying to rebuild their lives, and you're interfering with that. Now, Martha, this is just business. Nothing personal." Vance moved closer to the porch, his attention focused on Elijah. "We've been thinking about our last conversation, and we've decided to make you a better offer for the property. I told you before, it's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price." Vance gestured toward his companions. "We're prepared to offer you $50,000 cash for the property and everything on it. That's more than this place is worth by any reasonable measure. And if I refuse—" The smaller man, Cortez, smiled unpleasantly. "Well, that would be unfortunate, because we know you found something valuable out here, and we're going to have it one way or another." Martha stepped between Elijah and the men. "This is private property and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave before Sheriff Murphy arrives." "Sheriff Murphy isn't coming," Jake said with obvious satisfaction. "He got called away on an emergency. Something about a multiple vehicle accident on the interstate. Might be tied up for hours." Elijah realized with growing alarm that the emergency was probably staged to get Murphy out of the area. These men had planned this confrontation carefully, and they weren't planning to leave empty-handed. "Danny," he said quietly, "go inside and lock the door." "I'm staying with you, Dad. Go inside. Now." Reluctantly, Danny disappeared into the cabin. Elijah heard the door lock click into place, followed by the sound of the back door opening. His son was smart enough to create an escape route if things went bad. Vance was studying the property with obvious interest. "Your father did a lot of digging out here. Our research suggests he found something significant before he died. We'd like to examine his discoveries." "What research?" Jake stepped forward, his face flushed with alcohol and desperation. Samuel wasn't as secretive as he thought. He showed me some of his findings, bragged about striking it rich, said he was going to leave his son enough money to live like a king. Elijah doubted this was true, but Jake's associates clearly believed it. The desperation in Jake's voice suggested that his gambling debts had reached a crisis point where truth mattered less than hope. "There's nothing here," Elijah said firmly. "My father was researching local history, but he never found any treasure." Cortez laughed. "Then you won't mind if we take a look around." Without waiting for permission, 2 of the men started walking toward the creek where Samuel's stone markers were still visible. Elijah realized that Jake must have been watching the property, noting their activities and drawing conclusions about where they might have been searching. "Martha, you should leave," Elijah said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." "These men don't scare me, but they should have scared her." Elijah could see the calculation in Vance's eyes, the way he was assessing threats and planning his next move. These weren't the kind of people who were deterred by moral arguments or legal technicalities. "Look," Elijah said, trying to buy time, "even if my father found something, I don't know where it is. I've only been here a week." "That's where you're lying," Jake said with surprising vehemence. "I've been watching this place. I've seen you and the boy out there with surveying equipment, following the same pattern Samuel used. You found something and we want our share." "Your share?" "I helped Samuel with his research. I have a right to part of whatever he discovered." This was obviously a lie, but it provided Jake with the justification he needed for what he was planning to do. Elijah realized that negotiation was pointless. These men had already decided to take what they wanted. And the only question was how much violence would be required. The men who had walked toward the creek were calling back to Vance, excitement in their voices. They had found the location where Elijah and Danny had excavated the crate, and the disturbed earth told its own story. "Well, well," Vance said with satisfaction. "Looks like somebody's been doing some digging after all." Martha moved closer to Elijah, her voice low but urgent. "There's a shotgun in Samuel's bedroom closet. Top shelf behind the blankets." Elijah nodded almost imperceptibly. Samuel had always kept firearms in the house, a necessity in a part of the country where help might be hours away when you needed it. "Here's what's going to happen," Vance continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders that weren't questioned. "You're going to show us where you found whatever you dug up, and you're going to hand it over. In return, we'll let you keep the property and your lives. And if I refuse," Vance's expression hardened, "then we'll tear this place apart until we find what we're looking for. And you and the old woman will have unfortunate accidents. Your boy too, if necessary." The casual mention of violence against Danny crystallized Elijah's resolve. These men had made a fundamental error in judgment. They assumed that a single father trying to rebuild his life would be an easy target. They didn't understand that threatening his son had just transformed a desperate man into a dangerous one. "All right," Elijah said, raising his hands in apparent surrender. "You win. But the boy and Martha don't need to be part of this. Smart man. Now let's go see what Daddy left you." As they began walking toward the creek, Elijah caught Martha's eye and nodded toward the cabin. She understood immediately and began moving slowly in that direction, creating distance between herself and the confrontation that was about to unfold. 20 years of construction work had kept Elijah strong, and 20 years of single parenthood had taught him that some fights couldn't be avoided. They could only be won or lost. As he led Jake Morrison and his associates toward the creek, he was already planning how to turn their greed against them. His father had spent 5 years trying to find redemption through the treasure he had discovered. Now Elijah would have to fight for the right to claim that legacy, and the stakes were higher than any amount of Confederate gold. Behind them, Danny's face appeared briefly in the cabin window, and Elijah knew his son was watching everything, ready to run for help if necessary. The thought of Danny's safety gave him the focus he needed for what was coming next. As they approached the creek bank, Elijah was acutely aware of the tactical disadvantage he faced. 5 armed men against 1 unarmed father, with his son and Martha Henderson potentially in the line of fire. But as they reached the spot where he and Danny had excavated the Confederate crate, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Murphy's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of someone who had been planning this moment carefully. "That's far enough. Jake." Everyone turned to see Murphy emerging from behind the large oak tree, his service weapon drawn but held low, non-threatening but ready. What surprised Elijah even more was that Murphy wasn't alone. 2 other men in law enforcement uniforms flanked him, their position suggesting they had been in place for some time. "Wade," Jake's voice cracked with confusion and fear. "What are you doing here?" "I thought you were handling that accident on the interstate." "There was no accident." "Jake, we've been watching this property since yesterday, waiting for you to make your move." Murphy's expression was grim but satisfied. "You and your friends are under arrest." Vance's hand moved toward his jacket. But one of Murphy's companions, a man Elijah now recognized as a state police officer, spoke sharply. "I wouldn't recommend that. We've got you covered from 3 different angles, and we really don't want to do paperwork for a shooting today." For a moment, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Vance was clearly calculating his odds, while his associates looked around nervously for escape routes that didn't exist. Jake stood frozen between the 2 groups, apparently unable to comprehend how his carefully planned confrontation had turned into a law enforcement trap. "Jake," Murphy continued, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and making threats against a private citizen. Your friends here are looking at federal charges for interstate transportation of stolen goods and conspiracy to commit robbery." "You don't understand," Jake said desperately. Samuel Carter found a fortune in Confederate gold. It belongs to all of us. We helped him research it. Murphy's expression didn't change, but Elijah caught a subtle signal, a slight nod toward the cabin. Understanding immediately, Elijah began backing away from the group of criminals, while Murphy continued his conversation with Jake. Samuel Carter was working with us. Jake, he reported your harassment and your attempts to muscle in on his research. Did you really think the sheriff's department wouldn't notice when dangerous criminals started asking questions around town? The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Working with you? That's impossible. Samuel came to me 2 years ago when you started making threats. He was worried about what might happen to his son and grandson if word got out about his discoveries. We worked together to document everything properly and make sure it would be legally protected. Elijah reached the cabin and slipped inside, where Danny and Martha were waiting anxiously by the window. Are you all right? Martha asked quickly. Fine. Murphy's got backup. This was planned. Elijah moved to Samuel's bedroom and retrieved the shotgun Martha had mentioned. It was an old double-barrel, well-maintained and loaded. But I want to be ready in case something goes wrong. Through the window, they could see Murphy's team moving to arrest Jake's associates. Most of them surrendered without resistance, but Cortez made a break for the trees along the creek. He was tackled by one of the state police officers before he got 50 yards. As the immediate danger passed, Elijah found himself processing Murphy's revelation about Samuel's cooperation with law enforcement. His father had anticipated this confrontation and prepared for it, working with the sheriff to protect his family even after his death. Murphy approached the cabin as his team finished processing the arrests. All clear, he called out. You can come out now. They emerged from the cabin to find Jake Morrison sitting in the back of a patrol car, his face buried in his hands. His dangerous associates were lined up against their vehicles, hands cuffed behind their backs while officers searched them for weapons. Wade, Elijah said as the sheriff approached. What you said about my father working with you, how much of that was true? Murphy reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded paper. All of it. Samuel came to me about 18 months ago, right after Jake started making more serious threats. Your father was scared, not for himself, but for you and Danny. He knew his health was failing, and he was worried about what would happen to his discoveries after he died. The paper was a sworn affidavit, signed by Samuel and witnessed by Murphy, detailing Jake's harassment and documenting Samuel's treasure hunting activities. More importantly, it established a legal framework for transferring ownership of any discoveries to Elijah while ensuring law enforcement protection during the transition. He thought of everything. Danny said with obvious pride in his grandfather. Samuel was a smart man when he was sober, Murphy agreed. He knew that finding valuable treasure would make you a target, so he worked with us to make sure you'd have protection when you needed it. Martha examined the affidavit with interest. Is this why he asked me to hold that letter? He wanted to make sure Elijah was committed to staying before he revealed the extent of his precautions. Exactly. Samuel figured that if Elijah just wanted to sell the property and leave, the treasure could stay hidden indefinitely. But if he decided to make Clearwater his home, then he deserved to know what he was inheriting, both the opportunities and the dangers. As they talked, Elijah found himself reassessing his understanding of his father's final years. Samuel hadn't just been a sick old man obsessed with buried treasure. He had been a strategic thinker, planning carefully for contingencies and working to protect his family, even from beyond the grave. There's more, Murphy said, producing another document from his jacket. Samuel also worked with lawyers in Cheyenne to establish a legal trust. Any treasure found on this property is legally yours, but the trust provides for proper authentication, appraisal, and tax planning. Your father didn't want you to get rich, only to lose everything to legal complications. Danny looked between his father and the sheriff. Does this mean we can keep the treasure? It means your grandfather did everything possible to make sure you could keep it safely, Murphy replied. But there are still procedures to follow, papers to file and security measures to implement. Finding treasure is just the beginning. Managing it responsibly is the real challenge. As Jake's associates were loaded into transport vehicles, Elijah reflected on the morning's events. What had started as a confrontation with dangerous criminals had revealed itself to be part of a larger plan orchestrated by his father. Samuel had anticipated the threats they would face and prepared accordingly, working with law enforcement to ensure his family's safety. "Jake's going to prison," Murphy said, watching the patrol cars drive away. "His associates are looking at federal charges that will keep them locked up for years." "You won't have to worry about them anymore. What about the people Jake owes money to?" "That's a separate investigation. But with Jake in custody and no treasure for them to pursue, they'll likely write off his debts as a loss and move on to other business." Martha smiled with evident satisfaction. Samuel would be proud. He spent his last years trying to make up for his failures as a father, and he succeeded better than he probably ever imagined. As the afternoon wore on and the excitement settled into routine law enforcement procedures, Elijah found himself holding Samuel's badge, a sheriff's deputy badge from the 1970s that Murphy had retrieved from among his father's personal effects. "Your father was a deputy for 3 years when you were young," Murphy explained. "Had to resign when the drinking got too bad, but he never forgot the training. That's how he knew to involve law enforcement in his treasure hunting activities." Danny examined the badge with interest. "Grandfather was a deputy sheriff?" "Before he started drinking heavily," Elijah said. "I'd forgotten about that. The badge was tarnished with age, but still bore Samuel's name and badge number. It represented another aspect of his father's life that Elijah had forgotten or never fully understood. Samuel had once been a law enforcement officer, trained in procedures and protocols that had served him well in his final years. He never stopped being a deputy in his heart, Murphy observed. When he got sober, the first thing he did was come to me for advice about how to handle his discoveries legally. He wanted to do everything by the book. As evening approached and the last of the paperwork was completed, Elijah stood in the yard, looking at the property that was now safely his. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger challenge of managing his inheritance was just beginning. "Dad," Danny said, joining him in the fading light. "What happens now?" "Now we learn how to be wealthy responsibly," Elijah replied. "Your grandfather left us more than just treasure. He left us a roadmap for handling it properly." Inside the cabin, Samuel's journal and letters waited to be studied more carefully. The safety deposit box in Cheyenne contained additional documents and research that would guide their next steps. And somewhere on the property, additional cache sites waited to be explored under proper legal and security protocols. Samuel Carter had spent his final years seeking redemption, and he had found it in the most unlikely way, by becoming the father in death that he had never managed to be in life. His gift to his family wasn't just Confederate gold, but the wisdom and preparation necessary to enjoy that gift safely. As father and son walked back toward the cabin, Elijah felt a sense of closure that had been missing from his life for 20 years. His father's legacy was complex, equal parts failure and redemption, but it was finally completely his to accept or reject. He chose to accept it all. 2 weeks after Jake Morrison's arrest, Elijah sat at the kitchen table studying what he had come to think of as his father's war plans. The safety deposit box in Cheyenne had yielded a treasure trove of documents that revealed the true scope of Samuel's preparation for the confrontation they had just survived. The box had contained detailed maps showing all 5 cache sites, legal documents establishing ownership and tax obligations, correspondence with historians and archaeologists about the Confederate treasure's significance, and most surprisingly, a comprehensive security plan that Samuel had developed with Sheriff Murphy's assistance. "Your grandfather was preparing for a siege," Murphy observed, reviewing the documents during one of his regular security check visits. "Look at these defensive positions, communication plans, escape routes. He anticipated every possible scenario. Danny was particularly fascinated by Samuel's tactical planning. He marked sightlines from the cabin to all the major approaches, identified natural barriers, even figured out how to use the creek as a defensive obstacle. Why didn't he just move away? Elijah asked, studying his father's careful preparations. He could have sold the property and taken whatever treasure he'd found to somewhere safer. Martha, who had become a regular visitor since the confrontation, looked up from Samuel's correspondence with various experts. Because this was his chance to finally do right by his family. Moving away would have meant abandoning the larger treasure sites, and Samuel knew there was enough here to set you and Danny up for life. The full extent of Samuel's discoveries was still being catalogued. Professional archaeologists brought in through the legal trust had confirmed the existence of all 5 cache sites and estimated the total value of the Confederate treasure at over $2 million. More importantly, for tax and legal purposes, several of the items had significant historical value that might qualify for museum acquisition programs. The question now, Murphy said, is what to do about the remaining sites. We know where they are, but excavating them safely is going to require security measures that go beyond what the local sheriff's department can provide. This was the challenge that had been keeping Elijah awake at night. The first cache site by the creek had been relatively easy to secure. It was close to the cabin and could be monitored constantly. But the other sites were scattered across the property and beyond. Some of them in locations that couldn't be watched effectively without a significant security presence. What kind of security are we talking about? Elijah asked. Murphy consulted his notes. Professional security service, probably former military or law enforcement. Round-the-clock surveillance during excavation, secure transportation for any discoveries, coordination with federal authorities for the historical documentation. We're talking about several $1,000s in security costs, which we can afford now, Danny pointed out pragmatically. It's not just about money, Elijah replied. It's about bringing that kind of attention to what we're doing. Security teams, archaeological experts, government officials, pretty soon everyone in 3 states will know what we found here. Martha understood his concern. And some of those people won't be as easily discouraged as Jake Morrison's friends. The documents from Samuel's safety deposit box included warnings about exactly this problem. His father had researched other treasure discoveries and documented cases where publicity had led to theft attempts, legal challenges, and even violence. Samuel's recommendation was to excavate the remaining sites as quietly as possible, with minimal outside involvement. But there was another complication that Samuel hadn't fully anticipated. Dr. Sarah Chen, the archaeologist brought in to authenticate their discoveries, had identified the Confederate cache as potentially the largest Civil War treasure recovery in Wyoming's history. The historical significance meant that federal agencies were taking an interest, and that interest came with both protections and obligations. Dr. Chen wants to excavate the remaining sites as a proper archaeological project, Murphy explained. Full documentation, historical analysis, academic publication. It would protect you legally and probably increase the value of the discoveries, but it would also mean months of activity that can't be kept secret. What does she think about the security risks? Elijah asked. She's worked on high-value sites before. Her recommendation is to excavate one site at a time, with proper security and minimal publicity, until all the work is complete. Danny had been studying Samuel's maps and tactical plans with the intensity of a military strategist. Grandfather identified the most vulnerable site, he said, pointing to a location near the old mine shaft. It's the furthest from the cabin, hardest to monitor, and closest to the main road. If someone wanted to steal from us, that's where they'd start. Elijah looked at his son with a mixture of pride and concern. At 12, Danny was already thinking like the kind of person who could protect what they had built. But Elijah wasn't sure he wanted his son to have to think that way. What are you suggesting? We excavate that site first under maximum security. If we can recover what's there safely, the other sites will be easier to manage. Murphy nodded approvingly. That's smart thinking. The boy's right. If we can prove we can handle the most difficult site without problems, it will discourage anyone else who might be considering their own treasure hunting expedition. Over the following days, they developed a plan that combined Samuel's tactical recommendations with professional security advice. The excavation of the mine shaft site would be conducted over a long weekend, with a private security team providing perimeter monitoring, while Dr. Chen's archaeological team did the actual recovery work. The key is speed and discretion, Murphy explained during their final planning meeting. Get in, recover what's there, document everything properly, and get out before word spreads beyond the people who already know about it. But even as they made these plans, Elijah was aware of subtle changes in the community's attitude toward their family. The arrest of Jake Morrison and his associates had temporarily made them local heroes, but whispers about treasure and sudden wealth had a way of changing how people looked at you. Some folks in town are getting curious, Martha reported during one of her visits. Nothing hostile, but people are asking questions about what really happened out here and whether the stories about treasure are true. What kind of questions? The kind that come from people wondering if they missed out on something valuable. Jake Morrison wasn't the only person in Clearwater who knew Samuel was researching buried treasure. This was the scenario Samuel had feared most. Not violent criminals, but ordinary people whose greed had been awakened by stories of easy wealth. His tactical plans included recommendations for dealing with curious neighbors, treasure hunters, and what he called community pressure. Danny had been studying these sections of his grandfather's plans with particular interest. He says the most important thing is to control the narrative. If people think we found everything already, they're less likely to come looking for more. Your grandfather was a student of human nature, Martha observed. He understood that treasure brings out both the best and worst in people. As the weekend of the excavation approached, Elijah found himself thinking more about his father's motivations. Samuel had spent 5 years not just researching treasure, but preparing his family to handle the consequences of finding it. Every document in the safety deposit box, every tactical plan, every legal precaution had been designed to protect Elijah and Danny from the dangers that came with sudden wealth. He really did love us, Danny said one evening as they reviewed the security arrangements one more time. Everything he did was to make sure we'd be safe. He loved us the best way he knew how, Elijah agreed. It just took him most of his life to figure out what that meant. The night before the excavation, Sheriff Murphy stopped by for a final security briefing. Team arrives at dawn, sets up perimeter, and we start digging as soon as Dr. Chen gives the all-clear. If everything goes according to plan, we should be finished before anyone outside our circle knows what's happening. And if something goes wrong, then we find out how good your father's backup plans really are. Elijah walked outside after Murphy left, looking at the property that had become their fortress and their future. In the distance, lights twinkled in Clearwater, where people were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that their new neighbors were about to attempt something extraordinary. Danny joined him on the porch, carrying Samuel's old deputy badge. Think grandfather would be proud of how we're handling this? I think he'd be amazed that his plans worked as well as they did. What happens after tomorrow? After we finish with all the treasure sites? Elijah considered this. Then we figure out how to live with what we've inherited. The money, the responsibility, the attention. Your grandfather gave us opportunities, but he also gave us obligations. As they prepared for bed, Elijah found himself thinking about the morning ahead. In a few hours, they would either successfully claim the most vulnerable part of Samuel's legacy, or they would discover that his father's plans had gaps that could cost them everything. But for the first time since returning to Clearwater, Elijah felt confident about their chances. Samuel had spent his final years becoming the father he should have been all along, strategic, protective, and wise. Tomorrow would test whether that transformation had been thorough enough to keep his family safe. Outside, The wind carried the sounds of the night, cattle lowing in distant fields, the whisper of sagebrush, the lonely cry of a coyote somewhere in the hills. These were the sounds of Samuel's world, the landscape that had shaped both father and son. Tomorrow, they would either master that world or be mastered by it. Elijah chose to believe they were ready for whatever came next. Dawn arrived with crisp clarity, the kind of mountain morning that made Wyoming feel like the edge of the world. Elijah was awake before his alarm, reviewing Samuel's tactical notes one final time while coffee percolated on the old stove. Through the cabin windows, he could see the security team taking their positions, 4 professionals who moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to protecting valuable operations. Danny emerged from his room fully dressed, carrying Samuel's shotgun with the careful respect of someone who had been properly taught to handle firearms. "The perimeter team is in position," he reported. "Dr. Chen's archaeological crew should be here within the hour." Elijah nodded, struck by how naturally his son had adapted to their new reality. 3 weeks ago, Danny had been a city kid worried about fitting in at a new school. Now he was coordinating security for a treasure recovery operation worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sheriff Murphy's voice crackled over the radio they had positioned on the kitchen table. "Base, this is Murphy. Archaeological team is 5 minutes out. Everything looks quiet from the road." "Copy that," Elijah responded, using the communications protocols Samuel had outlined in his security plans. His father had anticipated this moment in remarkable detail, even down to radio procedures and backup communication methods. Dr. Chen arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by 2 graduate students and a photographer whose job was to document every aspect of the excavation. She was a small, energetic woman in her 40s, whose enthusiasm for Civil War archaeology was immediately apparent. "This is exactly the kind of site we hope to find but rarely do," she said, examining Samuel's research notes while her team unloaded equipment. "Your father's documentation is exceptional, better than most professional archaeologists manage." The walk to the mine shaft site took 20 minutes, following a path that Samuel had marked as the safest approach. The security team maintained visual contact throughout the journey, their positions carefully chosen to provide overlapping fields of view while remaining concealed from casual observation. "There," Danny said, pointing to the rock formation that matched Samuel's detailed drawings. "Grandfather's final marker." Dr. Chen examined the site with obvious excitement. "The stone arrangement is definitely human-made, and the positioning matches Civil War-era survey techniques. Your father knew exactly what he was looking for. The excavation began with methodical precision." Samuel's notes indicated that this cache was buried deeper than the creek site, approximately 4 feet down, and protected by both natural rock formations and deliberate camouflage. Dr. Chen's team worked carefully, documenting every layer of soil and photographing each stage of the process. Elijah found himself thinking about the men who had originally buried this treasure more than 150 years ago. Confederate soldiers, probably desperate and far from home, trying to hide valuable supplies from pursuing Union forces. They had chosen their hiding place well. It had taken a century and a half for someone to locate it again. "Contact," Dr. Chen announced after 2 hours of careful digging. "We have wood." The crate that emerged from the excavation was larger than the one they had found by the creek, and the brass fittings were more elaborate. The Confederate markings were clearer too, indicating this had been an official military shipment, rather than a collection of donated valuables. "This is the main cache," Danny said with certainty, comparing the find to Samuel's detailed descriptions. Grandfather thought this might contain military payroll rather than just gold coins. Dr. Chen's team carefully transported the crate to a secure location where it could be opened under controlled conditions. As they worked, Elijah monitored the radio traffic from the security perimeter. So far, their activity had attracted no unwanted attention. "Base, this is Watch 1, came the voice of the security team leader. We have civilians approaching from the south. Looks like a family hiking group, but they're headed in your direction. Elijah felt his stomach tighten. Samuel's plans had accounted for this possibility. Curious locals drawn by unusual activity on the property. The response protocol was designed to appear routine while discouraging further investigation. Copy. Watch 1. Implementing Protocol 3. Protocol 3 involved Martha Henderson, who had been positioned near the main road with her car and a cover story about helping with routine property maintenance. Her job was to intercept casual visitors and redirect them away from the excavation site. "Martha here," came her voice over the radio. "I see them. Just a family with kids looking for hiking trails. I'll handle it." As Dr. Chen prepared to open the newly discovered crate, Elijah found himself holding Samuel's old deputy badge, drawing strength from the connection to his father's careful planning. Everything that had happened since they arrived in Clearwater had been anticipated in some way by Samuel's research and preparation. "Ready?" Dr. Chen asked, her hands poised over the crate's corroded latch. The crate opened to reveal carefully arranged bundles wrapped in oiled cloth, each one labeled in the meticulous handwriting of Civil War-era military logistics. As Dr. Chen and her team unwrapped the bundles, the scope of the discovery became clear. Military payroll, Dr. Chen confirmed, but not just coins. There are promissory notes, official bonds, even what looks like Confederate Treasury certificates. This isn't just treasure, it's a snapshot of Civil War military finance. Danny leaned closer to examine the contents. "How much is it worth?" "Financially, probably several $100,000. But historically, this could be priceless. These documents could change our understanding of Confederate supply operations in the Western Territories." As the cataloging continued, Elijah became aware of increasing radio traffic from the security perimeter. The family of hikers had been successfully redirected by Martha, but their presence had apparently triggered interest from others. "Base, this is Watch 2, came a tense voice from the north position. "I have 3 individuals with metal detection equipment approaching from the tree line. They don't look like casual treasure hunters." Elijah felt ice form in his stomach. This was the scenario Samuel had feared most. Organized treasure hunters, who had learned about the Confederate cache through research or rumor, and were attempting their own recovery. Operation, can you identify them? Negative, but they're moving with purpose, and they have professional-grade equipment. Recommend we prepare for confrontation protocols. Dr. Chen looked up from her cataloging work. "Is there a problem?" "Possibly. How much time do you need to finish documenting this site?" "Another hour for proper documentation, but I can secure the artifacts immediately if necessary." Elijah made the decision that Samuel's tactical notes had prepared him for. "Secure the artifacts. We're implementing emergency extraction." The archaeological team moved with practiced efficiency, sealing the newly discovered treasure in protective containers, while the security team adjusted their positions to provide cover for a rapid withdrawal. Samuel's plans had anticipated this exact scenario: unauthorized treasure hunters attempting to interfere with legal excavation. "Martha, this is Base," Elijah radioed. "We need immediate police backup at your location. Possible attempted theft in progress. Copy." "Base, Sheriff Murphy is already en route. I called him when those hikers started asking specific questions about Civil War treasure." As they prepared to evacuate the site, Danny moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had studied his grandfather's contingency plans thoroughly. He helped secure the artifacts while monitoring the radio traffic, his young face showing the kind of focused determination that reminded Elijah powerfully of Samuel in his better moments. "Dad," Danny said quietly, "the metal detector people, they're not random treasure hunters. They knew exactly where to look." This was the realization that chilled Elijah to the bone. Someone with inside knowledge of Samuel's research was directing this attempt at theft. The question was whether it was someone from their own circle, or whether Samuel's security measures had been compromised in ways none of them had anticipated. "Watch 3. This is Base," Elijah called over the radio. Do you have visual on the approaching individuals? Affirmative, base. 3 men armed, moving in coordinated pattern. This isn't casual treasure hunting. These guys have military or law enforcement training. The situation was escalating beyond the scope of Samuel's defensive plans. Professional criminals with inside information represented a threat level that required immediate law enforcement response. But Sheriff Murphy was still 10 minutes away, and the security team was outnumbered. "Dr. Chen," Elijah said, "how portable are those artifacts?" "Everything essential fits in 2 cases. We can be mobile in 5 minutes." "Do it." "Danny, initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was Samuel's nuclear option, complete evacuation of the site with destruction of any evidence that might lead unauthorized persons to other cache locations. It meant sacrificing some archaeological value to protect the larger treasure discovery. But Samuel had been clear that family safety took priority over historical preservation. As they began the emergency evacuation, Elijah found himself thinking about his father's final years with new appreciation. Samuel hadn't just been planning for success. He had been planning for the moment when success would attract the wrong kind of attention from the right kind of people. The radio crackled with Sheriff Murphy's voice. "Base, this is Murphy. I'm 2 minutes out with backup. Hold your position and let us handle the approaching individuals." But as they gathered the precious artifacts and prepared for extraction, Elijah realized that the real test of Samuel's planning was just beginning. The morning's events had revealed that their treasure-hunting activities were being monitored by people with professional capabilities and inside information. The question now was whether Samuel's defensive preparations were sufficient to protect what they had built, or whether they would have to fight for the right to keep their inheritance. Sheriff Murphy arrived at the excavation site with backup just as the 3 armed men emerged from the tree line. The confrontation that followed would have made Samuel proud. His tactical planning had anticipated this exact scenario, and every element of the response unfolded according to his detailed protocols. "Sheriff's Department," Murphy called out, his weapon drawn but held low. "Drop your equipment and identify yourselves." The 3 men stopped their advance but didn't immediately comply. They were indeed professionals. Their formation, their equipment, and their calm response to law enforcement all suggested military or security backgrounds. But they had made a crucial miscalculation in assuming that a rural Wyoming sheriff would be unprepared for organized crime. "We're conducting authorized archaeological research," the lead man called back, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to talking his way out of confrontations. "On private property, without the owner's permission," Murphy replied. "That's trespassing, and the metal detection equipment suggests attempted theft." Dr. Chen had finished securing the artifacts in transport cases, but she was watching the confrontation with obvious concern. "Sheriff, these men knew exactly where to look. This isn't random treasure hunting." The revelation that had been nagging at Elijah suddenly crystallized. Someone with access to Samuel's research had provided information to these professional thieves. The question was who and how much they had revealed. "Danny," Elijah said quietly, "get to the radio and contact Martha. We need to know if anyone else is approaching the property." But as Danny reached for the radio, the device crackled with Martha's urgent voice. "Base, this is Martha. You have another problem. Dr. Chen's graduate students are asking very specific questions about other cache sites, and they've been making phone calls." The betrayal hit Elijah like a physical blow. Someone on the archaeological team was feeding information to the professional thieves, coordinating the attempt to steal what they were supposedly helping to preserve. "Dr. Chen," he said sharply, "where are your students?" She turned from watching the confrontation to see both graduate students backing away from the evacuation site, their expressions guilty and frightened. "Sarah, Michael, what's going on?" The young woman, Sarah, looked sick with fear and shame. "We didn't know it would be like this. They said they just wanted to verify the historical significance." "Who said that?" Murphy demanded. his attention now divided between the armed men and the potential traitors within their own group. People who claimed to represent a private museum, Michael stammered. They offered us money for information about Confederate treasure sites. We thought it was legitimate research funding. Dr. Chen's face went white with rage and professional humiliation. You gave site information to unauthorized parties? Do you have any idea what you've done? The situation was spiraling beyond Samuel's most pessimistic projections. Not only were they facing organized theft, but the theft was being coordinated by people within their own archaeological team. The professional thieves had inside information about security arrangements, excavation schedules, and cache locations. Murphy, we need to evacuate now, Elijah said, making the command decision his father's training had prepared him for. These people know everything. They're probably moving on the other sites while we're dealing with this distraction. Sheriff Murphy spoke into his radio while keeping his weapon trained on the 3 armed men. All units, we have organized theft in progress at multiple locations. Implement full property lockdown. But even as backup units responded, Elijah realized that Samuel's most important lesson was about to be tested. The treasure was valuable, but family was irreplaceable. All the Confederate gold in Wyoming wasn't worth risking Danny's safety or their future together. Dr. Chen, he said, leave the artifacts. Danny, we're going home. Dad, what about the treasure? Your grandfather spent 5 years teaching us that some things are more valuable than gold. Her safety is one of them. The armed men were now in custody, but the damage was done. The graduate student's betrayal meant that organized criminals knew about all 5 cache sites, had detailed information about security arrangements, and probably had additional resources they could deploy. As they walked back toward the cabin under police escort, Elijah found himself thinking about Samuel's final letter and its emphasis on family over fortune. His father had understood that the greatest treasure was the relationship between father and son, and that no amount of Confederate gold was worth destroying that bond. Martha, he radioed, meet us at the cabin. We need to implement your grandfather's final protocol. Samuel's final protocol was the most drastic option in his security plans. Complete destruction of all research materials, abandonment of remaining cache sites, and relocation of the family to a secure location until the threat could be neutralized. It meant giving up millions of dollars in potential treasure, but it guaranteed their safety. Dad, are you sure? Danny asked as they reached the cabin. Grandfather spent years on this research, and he spent those years teaching us that family comes first. The treasure is valuable, but we can't enjoy it if we're not alive to spend it. But as they began implementing the evacuation protocol, Sheriff Murphy's radio crackled with unexpected news. Sheriff, this is Detective Morrison from Cheyenne PD. We've been tracking this organization for months. The suspects you have in custody are part of a larger artifact theft ring. We need to coordinate on this operation. The revelation that their confrontation was part of a larger law enforcement investigation changed everything. Instead of being isolated victims, they were witnesses in a federal case against organized criminals who had been targeting archaeological sites across the western states. Detective Morrison, any relation to Jake Morrison? Murphy asked. My brother. Jake's cooperation with federal authorities led us to this artifact theft ring. He's been working to make amends for his previous mistakes. The irony was overwhelming. Jake Morrison, whose desperation and greed had created the initial threat to their family, was now helping law enforcement protect them from a more sophisticated criminal organization. Dr. Chen, who had been devastated by her student's betrayal, suddenly looked hopeful again. If this is a federal investigation, we might be able to continue the archaeological work under proper protection. More than that, Detective Morrison's voice continued over the radio. The suspects we've arrested today can provide information about other theft attempts. This could be the breakthrough we've needed to shut down the entire operation. As the immediate crisis passed and federal agents began processing the crime scene, Elijah sat on the cabin porch with Danny, watching law enforcement vehicles fill their yard. The morning that had begun as a treasure hunt had become something much larger, a test of Samuel's legacy and the values he had tried to instill. "Your grandfather would be proud," Elijah told his son. "Not because we found treasure, but because we protected what was most important," Danny nodded, understanding more about adult priorities than any 12-year-old should have to. "The treasure's still there, though. We can go back for it when it's safe, maybe, but even if we can't, we're already rich in the ways that matter most." As evening fell and the excitement settled into routine police work, Elijah reflected on the full scope of Samuel's gift. The treasure was valuable, but the preparation, the planning, and the focus on family safety were the real inheritance. His father had spent his final years becoming the man he should have been all along, and that transformation was worth more than all the Confederate gold in Wyoming. The climax of their treasure-hunting adventure was over, but the real story, the story of a family learning to trust each other and face danger together, was just beginning. 6 months later, Elijah stood on the completed front porch of their rebuilt cabin, watching Danny practice baseball with his new friends from Clearwater Middle School. The morning air carried the sounds of laughter and the solid crack of bat meeting ball, sounds that had been absent from their lives during the difficult months following his wife's death. The cabin bore little resemblance to the broken-down structure they had inherited. New roof, reinforced foundation, modern plumbing and electrical work had transformed Samuel's $1 legacy into a comfortable home. But the changes went deeper than construction and renovation. The building had become what Samuel always intended, a foundation for family life, a place where roots could grow deep and strong. "Dad," Danny called from the makeshift diamond they had created in the front yard. "Come hit us some ground balls." Elijah smiled and walked over to join the boys. At 13 now, Danny had gained confidence along with height, and his leadership among his peers reflected the security he had found in their new life. The boy who had been shy and uncertain just months earlier was now organizing neighborhood games and planning camping trips, with the kind of easy authority that came from knowing he belonged somewhere. "Your form's getting better," Elijah told his son as he picked up the bat. "Your mother would be proud of how well you're doing." Danny's smile faltered slightly at the mention of his mother, but the sadness was gentler now, mixed with good memories rather than raw grief. "Think she would have liked it here?" "I think she would have. Loved seeing you this happy." The federal investigation that had grown out of their treasure discovery had concluded 3 months earlier with convictions for the entire artifact theft ring. Dr. Chen had been cleared of any wrongdoing and had resumed her archaeological work under proper security protocols. The remaining cache sites had been excavated successfully, yielding discoveries that exceeded even Samuel's optimistic projections. The total value of the Confederate treasure, after taxes and legal expenses, had provided enough money to secure Danny's education, establish a trust fund for his future, and support the family comfortably for the rest of their lives. But more importantly, the experience had taught both father and son valuable lessons about courage, planning, and the difference between wealth and security. Martha Henderson arrived in her ancient Buick, carrying a covered dish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had news to share. At 72, she had become something between a grandmother figure and a trusted advisor, the kind of person whose approval mattered more than financial success. "Afternoon, boys," she called out, setting her dish on the porch table. "Elijah, I have something for you." She handed him an official-looking envelope bearing the seal of the Wyoming Historical Society. Inside was a letter recognizing Samuel Carter's research and documentation as a significant contribution to Civil War archaeology, along with an invitation to establish a memorial scholarship in his name. "They want to name the scholarship after your father," Martha explained, "for students studying Western Civil War history. The treasure he found is being used to teach future generations about the period." Elijah read the letter twice, struck by how appropriate the honor was. Samuel had spent his final years trying to make amends for his failures. And now his name would be associated with education and opportunity rather than disappointment and loss. "There's more," Martha continued, producing a second envelope. This came from the county assessor's office. The second letter contained the new property deed, officially establishing the Carter property's boundaries and value. The 40 acres that had once been worth $1 were now assessed at nearly $500,000, partly due to the improvements, but mostly because of the historical significance of the treasure discoveries. Danny jogged over from the baseball game, curious about the official correspondence. "What's all the paperwork about?" "Your grandfather's being honored by the State Historical Society," Elijah explained, showing him the scholarship announcement. "And our property has been designated as a historical site. Does that mean we can't change anything? It means we're the guardians of something important. Your grandfather's research helped preserve a piece of American history, and now it's our responsibility to take care of it." As the afternoon wore on, and Danny's friends headed home for dinner, Elijah found himself reflecting on the changes the past 6 months had brought. The financial security was wonderful, but the real transformation had been in their relationship with the community and with each other. They had become Clearwater residents in the deepest sense, people with roots, responsibilities, and connections that went beyond mere geography. Sheriff Murphy stopped by, as he did most evenings, ostensibly to check on their security, but actually to share coffee and conversation with people who had become genuine friends. The crisis that had brought them together had evolved into the kind of easy companionship that formed the backbone of small-town life. "Any word from Jake Morrison?" Elijah asked, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Got a letter from him last week. He's doing well in the Federal Witness Protection Program, helping with ongoing investigations into artifact theft rings. Says he's found some peace, knowing he helped stop the people who were threatening you and Danny." The irony of Jake's redemption wasn't lost on Elijah. The man whose desperation had initially threatened their family had ultimately helped protect them from more dangerous enemies. It was another example of how complex human motivations could lead to unexpected consequences. Dr. Chen had visited the previous month to present them with the final archaeological report and to discuss plans for a small museum exhibit featuring Samuel's research methods and discoveries. The exhibit would travel to schools throughout Wyoming, teaching students about both Civil War history and the scientific approach to treasure hunting. "Your father would be amazed by all this," Martha said, as they prepared dinner together in the cabin's expanded kitchen. "He spent so many years feeling like a failure, and now his work is inspiring scholars and students across the country." Danny looked up from his homework, algebra problems that would have been impossible in their cramped Denver apartment, but seemed manageable at the kitchen table of their Wyoming home. "Do you think he knew it would turn out this way?" "I think he hoped it would," Elijah replied. "But more than that, I think he understood that the real treasure was giving us the chance to build something together. The Confederate gold was just the means to an end." As evening settled over the valley and they prepared for another quiet night in their secure home, Elijah found himself thinking about the journal entry he had written that morning, a practice he had started as a way of documenting their experiences for future generations. November 15th, Danny's grades are excellent. His friendships are strong, and his confidence grows every day. The treasure that brought us here has been properly preserved and documented, but the real wealth is in watching my son grow up in a place where he feels secure and valued. Samuel's gift wasn't Confederate gold. It was the opportunity to be the father I always wanted to be, in a place where family could flourish. We've learned that true fortune isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of our connections to each other and to the land that shapes us. Outside, the wind whispered through the sagebrush, with the same voice it had carried for generations, speaking of continuity and change, of secrets buried and treasures found. The landscape that had seemed harsh and unforgiving when they first arrived had revealed itself to be generous and protective. offering both challenge and reward to those willing to work for what they wanted. Danny finished his homework and joined his father on the porch, carrying the worn baseball glove that had traveled with them from Colorado and had become a symbol of their journey together. The glove was perfectly broken in now, shaped by countless hours of playing catch and seasoned by the Wyoming sun. "Dad," Danny said, as they watched the stars appear in the darkening sky. "I'm glad we came here, even with all the danger and excitement, especially because of that. We learned we could take care of each other." Elijah nodded, understanding that his son had grasped the most important lesson Samuel's legacy had to offer. The treasure had been valuable, but the experience of protecting it together had been transformative. They had discovered they were stronger than their fears, smarter than their enemies, and more resilient than they had ever imagined. As father and son prepared for bed in their secure home, surrounded by friends and community, Elijah felt a deep sense of completion. Samuel Carter's $1 cabin had become the foundation for a rich and meaningful life. And the bastard son, who had been driven from Clearwater 20 years earlier, had returned to claim not just his inheritance, but his place in the world. The Confederate treasure had been found, documented, and preserved. The family legacy had been restored and honored. But most importantly, the cycle of abandonment and disappointment had been broken, replaced by the kind of love and security that could be passed down through generations. In the end, that was Samuel's true masterpiece, not the treasure he had discovered, but the family he had finally learned to protect.